This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and ideas and other issues that have caught our attention. Our guest today is an American-Israeli journalist who was until very recently based in Israel and the West Bank. Her new book, entitled The Unchosen, The Lives of Israel's New Others, has just been published in English by Pluto Press. The New Others, quote-unquote, refer to the various populations of migrant workers and asylum seekers who have come and gone and mainly stayed in Israel, often facing great hardships. Mya Guarnieri Jaradat is joining us on the line from Florida. Hello, Mya. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So refugees and asylum seekers have become a much more significant problem in recent years, especially in Europe, which has seen an influx of refugees from the imploding Middle East. But also with the election of Donald Trump as US president has also become an issue in American politics. Now, if you look at it against this backdrop, why was it important for you to tell the story of Israel's asylum seekers? After all, they make up only a tiny proportion of this global phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, it's kind of a coincidence. I came to this issue 10 years ago before anyone was kind of looking at asylum seekers. No one was looking at the asylum seekers crossing the Mediterranean then and heading to Europe, even though there was a large number already, this was already happening. No one was really looking at that. And people weren't really talking about asylum seekers in the US at the time either. So I came to the issue 10 years ago, and kind of by, coincidence, the issue has kind of come to the forefront of international consciousness in the past few years. However, I do think that Israel is a really important country to look at because it can kind of serve as a case study or maybe a petri dish for the issues that come with globalization and, the debate around asylum seekers. Why? Because in Israel, our feelings about national identity take on these kind of existential proportions. So, the issues of who's in and who's out and who belongs and how do they belong are so sharp in Israel. And so it kind of serves as this kind of, everything is turned up, the volume is turned up to 10 on this issue in Israel. And so we can kind of look at Israel as an example of what we could see happening in the U.S. and other places. And we can learn from what's happened in Israel.
So you're saying the kinds of issues that you're talking about, the boundaries of national identity, who gets to be in, who gets to be out, are not entirely unique to Israel, but Israel just sort of is in a spotlight or does them louder and sharper.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. And I think that something that's so interesting about looking at both asylum seekers and migrant workers in Israel is that on the one hand, it offers us this reflection of what's happening in other places in the Western world, or I want to call it a kind of hyper reflection because, again, it is, really sharp in Israel. So, we can look at this as an example for a global issue. But on the other hand, we can also kind of glean some insights about the conflict with the Palestinians by looking at how Israel treats these two groups of non-Jewish others.
What do you mean by that? What kind of insights?
Israel, basically, the argument usually is that our treatment of Palestinians is predicated on security. But when we look at groups like migrant workers and African asylum seekers, two groups that Israel has no security claims against. And we see that the state is using similar tactics, sometimes even using laws that were created to discriminate against Palestinians and turning them, against these groups. We can start to kind of question that security argument because in the case of these groups, it's about demographics, period.
Can you elaborate a bit on what these measures, what these practices are, and whether they are completely identical for the Palestinians and the asylum seekers, and if not, where do they differ?
Right. So with the asylum seekers, I mean, this is the place where you really see the example most clearly. With the asylum seekers, Israel has taken the 1954 Prevention of Infiltration Law, which was it was legislation that was originally drafted to keep Palestinians from returning to at that time, the young state of Israel. It was intended to keep them out. And anyone who was caught crossing the borders was deemed a quote unquote infiltrator. And that's a really strong, word. And I think it took on a kind of life in the Israeli imagination or in the Israeli subconscious. Infiltrator, it's a very loaded word. It's scary. It's, someone who's maybe a terrorist who's coming in, infiltrating in a sneaky way to get into the country and undermine the country. So they made this law in 1954, and then in the late 2000s, they took the law and started tinkering with it so it could be applied to African asylum seekers as well. And so we saw then the definition of infiltrator broadened to include African asylum seekers and to include people from these countries where the African asylum seekers are coming from. Whereas before, it was just the countries that were defined were just the countries surrounding Israel where Palestinian refugees were found. So it was brought in to be applied to African asylum seekers. And so basically, it allows the state to hold them without charge or trial. And that, of course, is reminiscent to me of administrative detention. Yeah.
So you make the interesting point that they, as people who are residing in Israel, they're treated much more like Palestinians than they are like Israelis. In other words, they're looked at as a hostile force and treated more similarly to that than they are looked at as, citizens minus in a way. But let me ask you, you raise a point about the fact that they're entering Israel illegally and being called right away infiltrators, and that's really scary. Is there a distinction that Israel makes between people who enter the country illegally or those who enter the country legally? I mean, you do distinguish in your book between migrant workers and asylum seekers. Is there a distinction between those who are legal and illegal in the country?
And also, the period that you cover in the book goes way beyond the beginning of the influx of Sudanese and Eritrean asylum seekers into Israel. As you said, it was at the end of the last decade. But this issue of non-Jewish migration into Israel started way before, as you do mention in your book.
Yeah, so the book, unfortunately, is 200 some pages. If I'd had it my way, it would have been about 500. The draft, honestly, I mean, I had a whole chapter about Palestinian day laborers and the first Intifada and the people who were working before the Intifada, blah, 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 blah. Why? Because migrant workers were actually brought to replace Palestinian day laborers.
So legally, by Israeli policy, these migrant workers were brought in. They were not infiltrators or crossing borders illegally. Okay.
Exactly. It's really, really, really important to distinguish between the two groups. Although I'm lumping them together as non-Jewish others, they are very distinct groups. The migrant workers are brought by the state of Israel. They come on visas that are issued by Israel, 63-month visas for the most part. They do enter legally. Now, as far as the African asylum seekers, while they might be entering without permission, once they're inside, they do get a visa. So, I mean, do we then call them illegal if they're walking around with a visa? The visa that they get allows them to stay in the country. They're getting temporary group protection from deportation, basically.
Exactly. They're also eligible to claim asylum by international law, whereas the migrant workers that were brought by the state earlier did not have this status.
That's right. So they're distinct groups, but at the same time, because they're both non-Jews and because they're both, viewed as a demographic threat because they're not Jewish, then there are some similarities that the state treats them. It's important, though, to note that I've not many people from either group that really have a strong desire to stay. Most migrant workers are coming to make money and go back home. And most of the asylum seekers, and not most, I haven't spoken to one single asylum seeker that wants to stay. They all want to go home. Like, it's not pleasant to be a refugee, Everyone wants to go home.
And tell me, sorry, go on.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry, I lost the thread. There was another point I wanted to make about the difference between the two, but I lost it.
That's okay. Well, tell us more about the debate in Israel over those who are asylum seekers. Israeli authorities and some of the more hardline discourse against them, claims, well, these people aren't really asylum. They're not seekers. I mean, they're not really refugees. They're actually economic migrants who are looking for jobs, but they've come under this disguise. Can you tell us more about that? Why would the state claim things like that?
And you know what? I love that you just said that, because that was the thread that I lost. So that was
it's a mind meld. It's a mind meld.
Yeah. So that's where we also see, that's why it's also kind of important to talk about migrant workers and African asylum seekers together, because the state, while they are separate groups and they're coming for separate reasons, this whole thing with the prevention of infiltration law, then the state started to kind of call them infiltrators, right? And then it said, well, they're not just infiltrators, they're work infiltrators. They're coming, to work, and they're coming for economic reasons. They're coming to steal jobs from Israelis. This is just, there's a really, really easy way to interrogate the government's claim. It's breathtakingly easy, and I don't know why it doesn't come to mind more often. Okay, if they're work infiltrators, then why are you not just deporting them back to their home countries? That's it. It's that easy. It's that simple. If a Filipino migrant worker who has come loses his visa or overstays his visa, it's that simple. The state will pick them up and deport them.
And the state does that. Is that what you're saying?
And the state does that with Filipino, with migrant workers, with people who really are there to work. But why doesn't it deport the African asylum seekers?
You're saying because the state actually knows that they would be sending them back to regions that are threatening to their lives.
Of course.
But won't admit it. Okay.
So that on the one hand, this is something that is so troubling to me about the treatment of asylum seekers, is that in public, the government is saying, oh, these are work infiltrators, and they've really worked very hard to turn the population against these people. But
knowing that it doesn't plan on making them leave.
But on the other hand, they let them stay, unlike neighboring countries that send them back.
Right. So to me, the fact that Israel is, on the one hand, calling them work infiltrators, but on the other hand, is not deporting them and is issuing them visas, kind of shows a kind of de facto acknowledgement that these people are indeed refugees. Now, what Israel will not do is Israel will not kind of go through their individual applications and give them refugee status. So they kind of live in this perpetual legal limbo that they can't work legally. Now they're being kind of taxed to death with this 20%. So they can't work legally, but if they do work, the state's going to hold 20% of their income. It's insane.
Tell us about that 20% income. Explain what that means.
So basically, the state has this plan that, okay, first of all, you need to understand that the sort of visa an African asylum seeker holds in Israel specifies that they cannot work legally. However, due to
I think it actually says this is not a work permit, which puts a sort of surrealist spin on the whole visa question.
Right, exactly. So it is just kind of a visa to exist inside the state's borders without being deported. And there's really, otherwise it's kind of useless, So the Israeli High Court did rule that they can work. So the state kind of turns a blind eye to them working on the one hand. On the other hand, there's this new law that will take 20% of their income and hold it until they leave the state. So then it's also supposed to be a kind of, I reckon, kind of incentive to get them to leave the state on their own, But these people it's not like they're making good money. They're working mostly on the black market. The wages are horrible. So, my question is how are they going to survive when they'll get even less in their pockets? And many of these people, it's not that they are sitting in Israel because they want to. They can't return to their home countries. So, Israel is dangling this kind of carrot before them. Oh, leave and you'll get the 20% we've been holding. But at the same time, they can't leave. So it puts them in even more impossible circumstances than they already are.
I wanted to ask you about the earlier wave of migrant workers, those who were 100% migrant workers from the Philippines and several countries in Africa that were, as you said, brought in by the government to substitute for Palestinian day laborers. And some of them ended up overstaying their visas and just staying in Israel illegally. And they had communities, especially in South Tel Aviv, that were really thriving communities. And they were, in many ways, and we're talking about 15 years ago, they were free to walk the streets. So they weren't persecuted in any shape or form by the government until there was a U-turn. suddenly. And the government started clamping down on them. Can you tell us about this change, how and why it came about?
Yeah. So you mentioned 15 years ago, and that would be the second Intifada. This is kind of a common idea that's out there, that migrant workers were brought during the second Intifada as a response to Palestinian violence and blah, blah, blah. Let's actually go back a little bit further. Migrant workers were actually brought during the first Intifada initially. So the first migrant workers came from Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. They started coming in the late 80s and early 90s. I interviewed one woman, a Filipino, who came in like 88, but she's, a veteran. She's there longer than most. But really in the early 90s, we kind of see a boom. And it was about the same time that Israel revoked the general exit permit that was held by Palestinians from the territories. So what does that mean? On the one hand, these Palestinian day laborers who are so important to the Israeli economy.
And so important to the Palestinian economy, I should add.
Also, which is a really important key to I don't get to in this book, that maybe I'll touch on in the next book, is about the kind of disastrous effect, after the occupation began and the territories were kind of opened in a way and Palestinian day laborers started coming in. They became very dependent on the work inside of Israel and the wages. And so when Israel revoked that general exit permit in 91 and implemented a general closure of the territories, which people don't realize that technically the West Bank is under a general closure now for over 20 years. So when it implemented this general closure, it had a problem. Israeli employers were used to inexpensive labor. Okay, well, what do we do? Oh, okay, we'll bring migrants from overseas. Now, right away, the government officials expressed concern. They said, Palestinian day laborers go home at night. They said these other people will stay. And the rhetoric we saw in the mid-2000s about, we need to deport them, we can't let them have children here, all of this actually began in the early to mid-90s with government officials saying things like, we need to deport them before they become pregnant. So on the one hand, the state was bringing them. On the one hand, of course, there was an awareness that when you bring human beings, human beings are going to fall in love and make babies. So, there was this awareness that this was happening, but there was also this kind of, there's not a policy towards non-Jewish immigration. So there was a kind of unofficial policy that we do not deport children, period. We just don't deport children. Now, we saw that change in 2009 with the announcement that, and there was, of course, you mentioned, Gilad, that there was a crackdown in the 2000s during the second Intifada around that time. So they did actually, I went ahead to 2009. Let me step back, 2002, 2003. There was a crackdown at that time. What the government tried to do then, because they still wouldn't deport children, is if they spotted a family, a mother, father, and child, what would they do? They would take the father and send the father back to the Philippines or wherever in hopes that the mother and children would follow. And this usually didn't work. Usually just the mother and children stayed in Israel alone. So a kind of interesting result of this that I touch on in the book is that in South Tel Aviv, you had this thriving community and included churches and churches that were run by male pastors. And as many of the male pastors were deported, you saw in their wake the rise of the women pastors.
So actually, it's a plot. It's a plot to advance feminism in religion.
Right.
Right.
You could argue that, But so you saw this kind of crackdown in 2002, 2003. That's what a lot of people say. Now, when I talk to people in South Tel Aviv, they say, we were still under pressure in between 2002 and 2003, that first crackdown, and then the announcement of the deportation in 2009. So to a migrant worker in South Tel Aviv, that pressure never let up. To us on the outside, we say, there was a crackdown at this time and then another. But there are stories, people were still being targeted and deported. I volunteered in a black market kindergarten where the woman who ran the kindergarten was subject to night raids. The police were coming in the middle of the night and asking her and her daughter for papers, and it's a way of pressuring the population and trying to get them to, quote unquote, self-deport. and they were also still looking for her husband to deport him. And he actually slept in the van for a number of years. He slept outside.
He slept
their
outside
van.
to avoid being deported if the police would come and see them all together?
Yes.
For how many years?
Because they were subject to these night raids. It must have been, I was volunteering there in 2007, 2008. So my understanding is that he'd been sleeping out in the van for a number of years at that point.
And Mya, you raise one of the most interesting aspects of the book, and I think that's the wide range of experience you had personally working and to a large extent living among this community, maybe not physically living with them, but spending a lot of time with them. Can you think of a particular moment or story or situation that really, stood out to you and moved you and made you say, you know what, I need to write this book, because this personal story that I experienced with so-and-so really touched me?
I wish I could say that there was one moment. There wasn't any one moment. It was just more of the place, that very first black market kindergarten that I volunteered in, or actually I could even go back further. The very first one that I saw, the first black market kindergarten I saw, and maybe I need to define black market kindergarten for our listeners. So basically before the age of 3, the Ministry of Welfare in Israel will recognize, of course, an Israeli child. So if you're a poor parent and you're a citizen of Israel, whether you're a Jewish Israeli citizen or a Palestinian citizen of the state, if you're, lower socioeconomic and you can't afford to send your child to daycare, but you need to work, the government will kick in and give you a subsidy and will help cover the cost of daycare. If you are a migrant worker or asylum seeker, meaning that you're not a citizen and you have a child in Israel and you need to work, you're on your own because the Ministry of Welfare does not recognize you or your children. Now, at the age of 3, the Ministry of Education does recognize the children of migrant workers and African asylum seekers. So at that point, they can go to the municipal kindergartens. But before the age of 3, and let's keep in mind that these early years are so critical to development. We're talking language, we're talking motor skills, we're talking every, side of development. So in these very critical years, these children are locked out of decent daycare, and their parents who are scraping by, don't know what to do. So they send them to the black market kindergartens or the babysitters, and these are unlicensed, unregulated, daycares. Some of the Israeli NGOs call them storage of children because some of the places are that bad. You see a place where a woman maybe has 20 cribs and she's got 40 children altogether and she can't keep up with it. So she, change their diapers and feed them, and that's all she can manage to do. The children will spend their whole day in their pens without any stimulation, without any love or warmth.
Tell us what you saw. Tell us what you saw, Mya, when you first walked in that first time to a black market kindergarten.
Yeah. So the first one I saw was in South Tel Aviv, like many of them, and it was an African. The black market kindergartens tend to run down ethnic lines. And I just remember that it was a place in the Neve Sha'anan neighborhood near the central bus station. And I remember, going up the stairs and in this horrible building, just this rundown building that's, full of litter and it smells like urine and alcohol, and the light wasn't working in the stairwell. And then we got to the top of the stairs and there's this sign. There was like a window, on the top floor, the window by the door. So enough light came in that I could read this sign, please pick up your children by 7 p.m. And I remember thinking, children, how could there be children in this building? And the woman I was with, who was a volunteer herself, knocked on the door and no one answered. And she knocked again and she said, it's me, it's Sivan. And the woman on the other side of the door was scared to answer because she was scared of the immigration police. And when she finally opened, and we looked inside, here is this bare concrete room. It's just bare, just concrete, maybe with a few mats, on it, just a handful of mats kind of scattered about, and, a couple dozen children and one woman, and they ranged from toddlers. And then there was some cribs over in the corner of the room that she had babies in. And these were, children under her care, just with nothing, sitting on a concrete floor. Some were just sitting there, some were crying, others were screaming and running around after each other. And it was just total chaos. And and shocking, and no bathroom. There was no bathroom in the place. And it was like, oh, how's that working? And it turned out the woman was also living there. Now, I was just, Tel Aviv, we think of Tel Aviv as cafes and beaches and art and startup nation and the gay pride parade and all of this. But, South Tel Aviv is the backyard.
Is this also why you want to write this book? As a Jewish American, do you feel that there's really no knowledge of this aspect of Israel in the Jewish American debate today?
I think that on the one hand, there's two problems. There's a lack of knowledge. And when there is knowledge, there's a willingness to kind of turn a blind eye. And I find that problematic, not just as a Jewish American, but also as an Israeli. When I took citizenship, I actually felt even more galvanized to work on these issues because, as a Jewish American, okay, if the state is doing these things in my name, well, it's not really my name. I'm American, it was more of a shade of gray. But then once I took citizenship, I felt very, very galvanized to throw myself more into the issues.
Well, this raises a lot of the kinds of questions I think we have about social problems and specifically about migration. I mean, Maya, I've seen whole camps of refugees living under bridges over the Seine in Paris in tent camps, hauling buckets of drinking water with medical vans coming around at night to help them. President Obama, we don't like to remember this, but he also deported 2.5 million immigrants from America. I mean, is Israel's policy problem really different from those of the other places that we're looking at?
Again, it's not. And that's why Israel's such a great example, is because it's this petri dish, it's this case study for what can go wrong. Obviously, what's happening in Europe and the U.S. has its own. I mean, we can also learn from that. We don't need to look only at Israel. But again, my kind of argument is that because national identity is such a sharp issue in Israel, that it's like this issue on steroids,
And also, as you mentioned briefly earlier, Maya, Israel doesn't really have migration policy for non-Jews. So in this sense, it puts it apart from other liberal democracies. I'm thinking, you said that you interviewed very few old-timers, that woman who came in 1988. I'm sure that there were very, very few of them left because there was really no legal provision for them to stay that long. The visa just expired at some point and, sometimes they overstayed it, but they couldn't do it forever. Is this really, I mean, how do these people, the old-timers, how do they make it?
Well, it's kind of amazing, actually. And something that doesn't appear in my book is the research. I made several trips to the Philippines and spent extended periods there interviewing and just kind of trying to understand, the Filipino community is the largest in Israel. So kind of trying to understand what these people have left, trying to understand their culture, things like this. None of that appears in the book. Anyways, I did interview a veteran, a woman who had been in Israel. How long was she in Israel? She actually came, but her story was different. She went with a Jewish American family and ended up going in with them and stayed with them. She had started working with the family in the Philippines and then followed them to the U.S. and then ended up with them in Israel and was in Israel something like 30 years and without a visa for a majority of the time. I don't know how she did it. I don't know how was she never picked up? How was she not? Now, she didn't have children. And it does seem that the authorities put more pressure on people who have children. So maybe that was it, that she was never walking down the street with a stroller. I don't know.
I feel like I have to mention here something that we haven't actually said, that the whole, fear that Israel has of these children, feeding a population of non-Jews into Israel. Let's remember for a second that in terms of the asylum seekers in Israel, at present, there's only about 40,000 of them. And at the peak, there were only about 60,000. Maya, maybe you can give us the numbers on the migrant workers.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the numbers on migrant workers, if we set aside the migrant workers number, I mean, the numbers are kind of all over the place. But if we want to talk about the children, which is what Israel's really focused on, these children, we're talking about, they're in the hundreds. We're not even talking about thousands upon thousands of children. We're not talking about absorbing that many. We're talking about hundreds, maximum, maybe several thousand,
Something strange
So
going on here. Let me ask you a final question, Maya. There's one point in the book where you say, eventually I had trouble staying in a place that deprived people of its basic human rights, which is a very powerful statement. I just wonder how you feel about living in the U.S. or any other country that has not solved the problem of all of its marginalized minorities.
Or has it changed your perspective about Israel, this distance?
Moving to the U.S. was not really a decision I made. I kind of followed my then fiance here. On the one hand, it's complicated, and this is what I'm tackling right now in my second book. On the one hand, there was a lot of discomfort about staying in Israel, considering what the state is doing as far as non-Jews. On the other hand, when I was there, I could advocate, I think, more effectively. And, no country is perfect. I'm not thrilled with what's happening in the U.S., and I object strongly to, what's happening under Trump. And, Obama was not the great, amazing. He definitely was a disappointment to me. But the point is of course, no country is perfect. And I was very conflicted about the quote unquote decision to leave. I remain conflicted. If things were different, if it were up to me, my husband and I would be living there. My husband is Palestinian. And so we're not even sure if we'd be able to live inside legally. And then living inside opens up many questions for him. And then, would I want to live out in the territories? Well, I did that for a year, and it was pretty difficult. I was actually living out there illegally.
And that is the topic of your next book, right?
That's right.
Right. Gilad and I are going, what? That's what I was going to say.
Exactly.
Okay.
Mya Guarnieri Jaradat, an Israeli-American journalist and the author of the newly published The Unchosen, The Lives of Israel's New Others. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.
What you said, Dalia, about other countries, this is something that I've been thinking while reading Maya's book and talking to her right now. When I was a journalist in Paris, one of the big features that I did was about Afghani refugees in Paris. It was big at the time. It was about, I think it was 2009. Many of them came in, and you could see exactly the same kind of bureaucratic torture that the government exacted on them. It was a right-wing government, Sarkozy's government. There was a notorious...
Sarkozy, who made his political reputation being tough on immigrants, even in his rise to becoming president.
Absolutely. So I really don't know. I saw some harrowing things. I spoke to this, I remember, a 14-year-old Afghani who came all alone. He was sent off by his mother after his dad had died in an air raid. Really harrowing stories. And, what can you say? Life's shit, isn't it?
Yeah. This is the point I think is on my mind while reading Maya's book, which is an excellent, as she points out, an excellent sort of window into what happens in Israel. But it's hard for me to see that any country has truly managed to solve this problem. Maybe Israel brings certain angles to it. But like you, and we had him on the show, Holger Michel, who runs the shelter in Germany, which I visited and spoke to people there, and the things that they've been through in many of the countries right inside Europe or just on the margins of the European Union does not speak well of their treatment by those Western countries or indicate that it's any particularly better than it is in Israel. Not to justify anybody's bad policies, but this is clearly a big global problem that nobody solved.
And the fact that Israel doesn't really have a migration policy other than the law of return, which applies, of course, only to Jews, is really a double-edged sword here. On the one hand, they really have no horizon. They have really no prospect of naturalizing, even not the asylum seekers, even the migrant workers who came in and, found a job, made a living and contributed to the Israeli economy and the Israeli society. They cannot stay after a while. On the other hand, the fact that this law exists kind of preempts any kind of demographic concerns that might be. Sometimes you hear right-wingers saying about all these NGOs that work with refugees, all they want to do is just naturalize, open our gates to millions of Africans so that Israel will cease to be a Jewish state. And that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny in any shape or form.
No, it certainly doesn't stand for scrutiny in terms of the numbers, even at the peak of migration in the 09, 10, 11, 12 era. But also, as Maya pointed out, my experience with this community, which I do have some, is that, like she said, most of them would really love to go back home. And as long as their home countries are sort of uninhabitable or actually life-threatening, they'll look for other places to be. But why is nobody even paying attention to what their actual desires are? It's something to also keep in mind. Certainly, if Israel makes their life so hard, they don't particularly want to stay in Israel either. We also might, it's just something to think about, that even people who were treated with the utmost support from the Israeli authorities, and I'm talking about the immigrants who came from the former Soviet Union, who were considered Jewish and given citizenship and given lots of support by the government. There were over 1 million who immigrated to Israel, and nowadays there's only about 750,000. Those people, some of them were old and died, but a lot of them left. And when you talk to people in that community, they also say, life is better somewhere else, which doesn't speak well of of something. I don't know exactly what it is, because those people were treated very well.
There are native Israelis who say that too. And
that's true.
And that's the home and native land, isn't it?
Maybe we're just a community of wanderers and we make other people into wanderers.
Maybe we're just a community of whingers.
But this does really raise, the thing is, this topic raises such enormous issues. And I feel for Maya when she said she had lots of other angles to write about in the book and couldn't get them in. We didn't even manage to discuss the journey that some of the migrants from Africa have to take to get into Israel and what they go through walking through the Sinai Desert, often at the mercy of really nefarious forces, Bedouin who supposedly lead them and sometimes take them hostage and hold them for ransom and torture them. Really terrible stuff. So there's many angles this raises. We certainly have not seen, explored every aspect of this situation, but I think that it is obviously topical for any listener in the Western world dealing with large...
Absolutely, and especially the future readers of Maya's book.
That's right.
All right, just to tell you, our listeners, to say thank you, essentially. We just got to the statistics, our listening stats for July, and it was a record-breaking month.
And we don't just mean the heat.
We don't just mean the heat, even though it's really intolerable. But unlike the intolerability, if that's a word, of the heat, the fact that so many of your listeners are listening to us is great. And thank you very much. Most of you are in the US and in Israel, but also in other English-speaking countries and other European countries, such as France, Germany, the Netherlands, and even Sweden. Quite a few. So
tak.
Thank you. Toda, merci, danke, danku, tak, and gracias, and
Havala.
Havala, which is in
Serbo-Croatian, just in case, you never know.
Yeah. To all those of you who are listening to us in Belgrade at the moment, thank you. And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Check out our archive. There are more than 300 interviews to keep you busy and interested, hopefully. Also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.